So I think we can start. It's 11 a.m. Hello, everybody. And today is Monday, Agile Mondays. So we are speaking about agility. Thank you all for joining and welcome. And also happy Orthodox Easter to those who celebrate today. My name is Elena Griniuk and I'm responsible for the Central Eastern Europe at the SME Banking Club, and I will be your host today. I'm glad to be joined and supported in this Agile series by John and Mark Williams from Agile Business Consortium and Maria Tsinusa from Integrated Consulting Group. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Elena. Nice.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so before we start, just short organizational moments from my side. So our webinar is scheduled for half an hour. The format of our Agile webinars is panel discussion, so you're welcome to type your questions right now from the start, and we will be answering them during the discussion. And please type your questions into the chat. Also, we are recording this webinar, and right after we finish, you will receive the link to the video and to the presentation. So today we are continuing the topic of Agile Finance, and as we discussed last Monday, that finance is one of the elements, of the core elements of the Agile Business Strategy, and actually none of the organizations can possibly perform without finance. This is why Agile Finance is so important, and actually that we discussed that finance should be embedded into each part of the organization. So if you missed our previous episode, I invite you to watch it full on our SME Banking Club YouTube channel. But now let's continue our discussion. So John and Maria, I'm passing the award to you, and would you maybe summarize shortly the previous part and let us continue this topic?
Yeah, by all means, Elena. Thank you very much indeed. What I'll do actually is I'll go back to two slides. This first one, which basically shows the Agile Business Strategy and the other four core elements: people, marketing, operations, and finance, just to illustrate the fact that finance is an integral part of the whole business and its Agile Business Strategy, not a separate function. And we followed that up by saying that actually Agile Finance is the power to use the other parts of the business, strategy and tactics and technology, to achieve a competitive advantage. And in a way, alongside people, finance is the other of the two most important elements in achieving a competitive advantage or in delivering customer value for the organization. So, and then we said we covered the three, I won't call them three principles, because these are based on the 12 principles of Beyond Budgeting. And if you have a look, Google Beyond Budgeting, have a look at their website, bbrt.org, you'll see there the 12 principles of Agile Finance and Beyond Budgeting. And I've distilled them into three functions in the organization. One is around timescales, and last week we looked at timescales and how we move from annual budgets to rolling 3-month timescales, for example. And this week we wanted to look at the other two core elements here about trust and about transparency. So that brings us up to where we are now, and I think now we can have a conversation. Maria, your thoughts?
Yes, so as I think we left out last time when we were discussing about the finance role, basically, we sort of made like a presentation of all these three angles that in which finance is supporting the organization and is enabling business agility. And we discussed a bit more about the timescales. We're leaving with the idea of finance as a business partner, that as a proposal, as an alternative for the way the roles should change for the finance function these days. And I'm picking up on what you said before about around the discussion of delivering customer value, because that is one of the core principles of Agile, yes, and we should all have the organizations around how to define build around how to define customer value, and this is like the main core of the main purpose of what we are doing right now. The finance as a business partner in this seek for customer value is is a role that has a lot of implications. First of all, is supporting strategy, because it needs to understand business as being at par, let's say, with the business partners that he has. It needs to understand the driver of the value, but at the same time, finance is the part that is constantly offering financial insights to the business, so that the strategic decisions can be taken considering numbers and taking into consideration real data and new business models, so that everybody has so that the business has the right information in place to take the best decision that they can take. Furthermore, the standard role of the finance is to deliver performance metrics and to make sure that it has milestones to measure progress. But this is a role that is actually transforming as well, because finance right now should empower more the business with the use of financial data. It should deliver the business with information in a modular format, in which the business can actually aggregate their own data to their own use. So it should enable the management information on a self-service platform, so that business can at all time access finance information without depending on the finance partners, on the finance let's say colleagues. It's moving from the control function that we have right now. We control the numbers, we give you the numbers, towards a partnership and towards building trust. Yes, right. John, you.
Absolutely, and you can see I'm desperate to say something here. You're absolutely right, because the idea that in a beyond budgeting framework, that the top-down decree and control becomes devolved to those people who are closer to the customer to enable them to deliver that increased customer value. That's empowerment. And there needs to be a trust at the basis of that empowerment. The organization needs to be able to trust those people who are facing the customer to be able to operate in the best interest, not just of the customer, but of the organization. And that trust can only come from a deep insight which the data provides, and the finance teams, of course, are in some ways in a better position than anybody else, not just to be able to produce data, especially if it's done on a rolling basis, so it gets closer to real time. They are also in the best position to be able to interpret that data and feed back to the organization. The data is telling us this, and this is what we could usefully do with that data. So once again, we get, even at the level of displaying trust and deploying empowerment, we get that role for the finance teams, which actually fits the whole organization, not purely the finance function. And I think it's really, really important that finance, and particularly Agile Finance, is embedded in every part of the organization, because that trust can then start to become inherent everywhere, which leads quite nicely into the transparency. Because, of course, the point about data is that it needs to give information, and the more transparent things are within the organization, the more that data can be not just visualized, but actually interpreted. So once again, the finance team becomes crucial in all of this.
Indeed, I think trust and transparency are the different sides of the same coin. You cannot have trust without having transparency, and you are transparent with your partners when you trust them. So it's as simple as that. And actually, the partnering between business and finance is actually making sure that this knowledge transfer between both sides is running smoothly, and this is how you gain the business agility, because it's not only that finance needs to understand how business is operating so that they can serve them best with the data that they require in their strategic decisions, but also business needs to have fundamentals of finance in order to take those strategic decisions. So this is like a two-way street, and this kind of financial acumen needs to be built in the business area as well, because you need to make sure that the choices that you make are not subjective choices. You need to make sure that you are not biased when making these choices, and that you're always trying to have an equal, let's say, approach to the choices that you make towards your customers.
Do you think then, because that idea of the business understanding the way that finance works in the same way as finance understands the way the business works, and you mentioned last week the excellent idea of having finance business partners in the same way that we've had HR business partners for quite some time, based in various parts of the business. Do you think that it actually might be useful for people within the business who are not finance specialists to actually start to become more educated, more capable in at least the fundamentals of Agile Finance, even though they will not be running the finance function, so that actually they can make better use of their finance business partner? Do you think that's something that should be explored further?
Actually, well, I'm a finance person myself, so I might be biased when I say this, but but I think when you look at the roles that the agile roles that you have, right? You have also a role in which you have the customer representative within your team, which in Scrum is called a product owner, which at all times needs to make this kind of decisions. What shall I deliver next? And this kind of increment delivery is made. The prioritization in itself, it should be made actually based on objective principles that you have. And those objectives is like this product owner is constantly running in their heads like a business case, pros and cons, what is the biggest value, what are the biggest risks that I need to mitigate. So basically you sort of need a person in the product role has this kind of finance talent, if you want, or this kind of finance information, because this kind of choices, as mentioned last time, I think very few of us, statistically speaking, have a nose for things, an intuition. The rest of us, the mortal ones, we need to have knowledge and to base our decision on objective terms.
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, first of all, I know, because I often think of myself as being intuitive, actually intuition isn't necessarily always right. So we do still need to have the knowledge, the data, the insight that all of that real time, if we can get it, response in terms of information can give us. The second thing, and this is quite important, I think, really, even in an agile world, we still need to have an eventual outcome which is further away than the current sprint. We still need to have an objective. Now, that we can call that objective customer value. However, we need to be able to define it much more clearly than that. And in some ways, one of the challenges I think that finance has faced, traditional finance has faced, is the focus on the eventual outcome, the need to have very clear guidelines and milestones on the way to that eventual outcome, and the rigidness, therefore, of financial processes. It's quite difficult then to expect finance people and the business to suddenly say, okay, we'll be less rigid about the financial processes, unless actually we can keep that outcome in mind. And it might be a particular profit margin that the organization is focused on, particular market share, whatever it is. We must not forget that Agile Finance does not preclude having a very clear destination for the organization.
Indeed, a lot of people are confusing having business agility or being agile with chaos, and it's giving an excuse for people when I've seen this a lot of times with companies that I'm working with, and also in my experience, that you get less information, you are pushed to do things faster and in a way a bit more shallower than before, and all in the name of let's be agile. And this is sort of causing an increased level of irritation in people towards Agile. Now, by all means, Agile does not mean to have a chaotic approach, but it actually means that you define very well what is your purpose. You take that as a reference point and you work with principles. You do not work with something that is with control. You do not work with predefined recipes on how to do things. And actually, this is the step that people need to move from, because the standard control environment in which in which a lot of the things are defined by procedures, by product roadmaps, by something that is very, very strict, right now is moved towards the principle. As you said before, we should keep the principles of, delivering that much customer satisfaction, delivering that much increment for the customer, preserving a profit ratio for the company. Within that purpose, the actions that we need to take as a team, being closer to the customer, are actions that we cannot foresee today. But we all respect, and we agreed from the beginning, we agree what are the principles in which we operate. And this is actually sort of very difficult to be done because trust kicks in. And managers and finance as well need to trust the people that they will comply, let's say, they will agree with the principles, and without having a predetermined way to do things. But it's not only from managers, it's also from the teams. A lot of the teams, when they first start to work Agile, they are a bit disoriented because they are used to have this perimeter quite clearly defined, and they don't know how to operate in this environment, and they shy away. They realize the responsibility. So this is like a two-end street. This thing that is happening with towards business and finance.
Yes, and interestingly, I remember explaining to somebody once that a self-organizing team is not actually a natural event. Unless there is an outcome that all the team is aware of and buys into, it's very difficult for a team to self-organize. And it's like, if you give people a ball and say, go and play the game, unless you tell them which game to play and which direction the goals are in and stuff like this, it's difficult for them to self-organize. Although actually some will, if they've played the game before. One of the things that's interesting here, I remember somebody saying to me once, the problem with Agile is, as you said, it's chaotic. It's like anarchy. And some of you may have heard me say this before. I said, actually, it is like true anarchy, because true anarchy is not an absence of rules. It is an absence of rulers. And that's what Agile is like. There are some very serious disciplines associated with being an Agile organization. And the principles are those disciplines. What they don't say is you must do this on this day at this time, every single time. Otherwise, you're not doing it right, because that actually is not what principles tell us. Principles tell us how to behave, not what to do on a minute-by-minute basis. The point is, though, Agile is based upon discipline, and those principles are part of that discipline. And this is where it merges beautifully with finance, because finance, in a way, finance will always have an outcome in mind. It might be profitability. It might be customer value for a certain commitment in financial terms. It might be market share or competitiveness, whatever. Finance always has to have and needs to have an outcome in mind, but actually is, as a discipline, is relaxed about how we achieve that outcome. And in a way, finance, whilst it's deemed to be rigid, lends itself to agility almost more than any other part of the organization. Because if we allow trust, and we also provide or require transparency, we get the flexibility that agility gives us by trusting people with the resources, and we also get the discipline that comes in providing absolute transparency. So finance actually lends itself very well to agility.
Indeed. And the part I'm picking up on this part with transparency, because I think I mentioned before in one of our webinars, being transparent requires to be very brave, because being transparent is not only showing a halfway product that it's not perfect, but you want to get the feedback so you understand what is the best route to go further. But being transparent from finance perspective is also being transparent about performance. And all the teams in Agile, and this is again one of the stuff that Agile and finance have a lot in common. In Agile, the principle is that you are building teams that are self-organized and for which their, say, mojo is to constantly improve themselves, and they take regular times in which they are seeking for ways to improve themselves. But this is not a discussion that they do based on how do we feel this week, do we feel confident on. No, Agile teams are working with numbers. They are constantly measuring what they're doing. They are constantly measuring against the result they wanted to have. They are constantly measuring against their previous performance, so that they are seeking always ways to improve. And transparency in this one kicks in very beautifully, because when you are having several Agile teams and you're having transparency about performance as well, then maybe you don't get into the competition, and this is very difficult for the leaders to manage, but you get into the mood in which we learn that somebody is very good and we want to go to them and we are asking, how did you manage that? I want to learn from you. And this is actually, let's say, going beyond the so-called agency problems. It's actually focusing people in a company on what is important, on their performance, on the company itself to develop, and on the customer to be satisfied.
Yeah, and interestingly, that helps enormously with the challenge of needing to be brave. Because, of course, not everybody wants to be courageous and commit publicly to having underperformed. Because essentially, if we haven't achieved everything we set out to do in the last sprint or the last week or whatever, then we have underperformed. And to make that public is a very courageous thing to do. But actually, if we see as a response, not blame, but ways in which people can help us to perform, actually that will do a great deal to give people more courage in future. And this again is where finance can be really, really effective, because when we ask people to be brave, we are asking them to take a risk. Finance is all about risk, about understanding risk, about managing risk, about predicting risk. And the more insight that the finance team can provide as a response to the teams, the more insight they can provide, the more data they make available, the more credible interpretation they can give the teams about that data, the more it will become evident that actually being brave is still a challenge. It's not an opportunity to be condemned by anybody, because the numbers will tell us, okay, we were brave enough to say we didn't perform as we hoped. However, the insights that finance give us tell us why that happened, and they also tell us what we can do to do something about it. So that once again, the finance team, based on the reduction of rigidity and timescales to real-time following, the idea of creating an atmosphere of trust and an atmosphere of transparency, finance once again proves itself as the foundation for all of the business and justifies being embedded in every part of the business. So
I was thinking now, well, I think actually the being brave is always a challenge, but I was thinking what would be your recommendation, or how practically banks or either organization can actually shift the finance team from the control functions that we were discussing to this partnership function, that the finance team practically will be embedded to each part of the organizations. What are your recommendations? How banks can do this?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to recognize that this is not going to happen overnight. Okay, this is a fundamental shift, a transformation in the proper sense of the word, from where most banks currently are to where we and they would like to be in a truly agile banking environment. So the first thing would be not to try and move the bank away from its current controls. That's really important, because if one removes those current controls, then the basic principles on which the bank is currently founded may be challenged. So the idea is to identify a number of people within the finance function in the bank, have conversations with that finance function about how they might become a finance business partner for other parts of the bank. And those parts can be as big as one likes, really. It could be the whole business banking or corporate banking or SME banking function. It could be a small part of that in a small geography or in a small office. But just identifying who is there in the finance team who could become much more embedded in the business work. It is, in some ways, as simple as somebody from that division going to the finance team and saying, can we sit down and have a chat? Because actually, we'd like to see if we can do things together better. So that seriously is the very first thing. It's communication with the finance team or between the finance team and other parts of the business.
I will add something to what John has said, and I switched off a bit and I came back. So I will add that the same way of identifying a person, the right person in finance for that. I think you also need to identify the right person in business for that, because in a team you'll always have people that are more detail oriented, that take more pleasure in working with the numbers, and people that tend to be more on the creative side or more on the improvising side. It is great to have a diverse team, and it's great to encourage everybody in your team to follow what they like to do best. And I actually had, in my experience, the pleasure of working with a very good finance business partner. But at the same time, I had like an extension of the finance function in the team as well, so that in the tribe, let's say, so that from the business side, that person would understand what are the drivers from finance perspectives, what are the risks, how do we measure them, what are the signals that are there in order for us to allow that we are to allow our understanding that we are approaching something, we are approaching a barrier that we don't want to have, or we need to impose some mitigation actions.
Yeah, and also I think it's quite important to, in some ways sometimes, to get away from the formal. So if there is a team within the bank that's already working on a project in an agile way, invite somebody from the finance team just to come along to the stand-ups or the sprint reviews, or whichever it is, the mechanism by which the team gets together on a regular basis, and just invite somebody from the finance team to come along and have a chat and to contribute. Because it's important here that engagement between the business and the finance team does not make either team feel like they are just a spectator. The idea is actually to create a team, and I think the what's the word I'm looking for? The flexibility in the ways that might be done means that you can look at it in an agile way and not necessarily be formal at the start, but actually hope to be more formal and more engaged in the future.
Yeah, it's true. And the same goes, because we are talking mainly to bankers these days, and courtesy of Olena. Yeah. The same goes with finance and as well risk, because in a bank, these two functions are like two peas in a pie, basically. So finance is from the financial perspective, but risk is also from all other types of risk that are present in a bank. Yes, so these kind of support functions are critical to the success of a bank. They are prone to be one of the most conservative parts of the bank, but business, agile or not, cannot do without these two parts of the business. So indeed, involving them in the regular, let's say, business processes, not in the way of, going to extreme now where we are inviting finance or risk to all our meetings. So everybody goes crazy because their schedule is filled with meetings. Yeah, keeping a sense of relevance, but trying to build that kind of culture that we are collaborating with each other. We are not in the business fighting with finance for the budget. We are not in two different parts. This is not like a tennis, or each side is on one side. We're not competing, because you see that a lot in the organization, business or sales. It feels that they are misunderstood. I think the blame is on both sides. Yeah, everybody's trying to guard their knowledge best they can. But if we start to share and trust the other party that they will understand and they will act with the same principles that we act, actually you enhance collaboration and the business can only grow from there.
Yeah, and what you've just described drives the trust and transparency agenda in a way that nothing else can really. Just get together, actually. Just get together and assume that, quite rightly, as you say, they're not competing. The competition should not be within the bank. There's enough competition outside the bank.
Yes. Thank you, John, Maria. We are actually, our time is coming to the end, and as we are closing the topic of Agile Finance today, so would you do a very short summary of the topic? Because we will switch to another one next Monday.
Yeah, sure. Agile Finance is based around three things within the organization. Moving to timescales which reflect the rhythm of the organization and the rhythm of the marketplace, rather than just being annual budgets. Developing an atmosphere and environment of trust, so that those resources which are vital to providing customer value are actually devolved to the people most close to the customer. And thirdly, creating an atmosphere of transparency, so that everybody sees what contribution everybody makes to the organization. And I think if we can achieve those three things, Agile Finance will emerge almost naturally within an organization.
Yes, I really like the idea of trust and transparency. And the only thing that I could add to what John has said is that actually organizations are here. Of course, they want to make profit, but the only way to make profit and to survive is if you satisfy your customer. The way that we are organized right now, we are organized by departments that have nothing to do with satisfying the customer. They have to do with our own way of organizing things. When you start really thinking about the customer, this is where you gain the business agility, because this is how you start to build inside your own organization the value streams that are relevant to deliver what the customer wants. And around that, you'll find the finance or some other functions that right now are regarded more like the watchdogs inside. So ideally, we should not talk in terms of business agility. We should not talk about agile in this department, agile in that department, agile in that department, because it sort of is counterintuitive. We should talk about business agility as a whole. And depending on the industry, on the company, or wherever we are, how we build that inside is actually a function of the customer. It's not a department that we want to guard.
Nicely put.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John and Maria, for contributing today. And thank you to all our attendees. And see you next Monday, 11 a.m. Thank you. And
thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.